Over the weekend, former President Trump's attorneys filed a motion against Twitter and its CEO, Jack Dorsey, to force the social media platform to restore Trump's account following his January 6th ban. The filing accuses Twitter of selectively enforcing its policies against Trump, noting that the Taliban appeared on the platform in August. It also alleges that the company had been coerced into banning Trump by members of Congress. Team Rising is here to weigh in. National political reporter at The Hill, Julia Manchester, and assistant editor at Chronicles Magazine, Pedro Gonzalez, join us now to discuss. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Pedro, if the courts accept the reasoning here, are we a huge step closer to thinking of social media platforms as kind of publicly regulated utilities rather than the private companies that they consider themselves to be now?
Maybe. That seems to be one direction that the right, conservatives, at least on the intellectual side, are moving towards. So I think that's an interesting development. But for Republicans, I think the point might be missed here that Trump allowed some of these things to happen. When he was in office, he's admitted to having people like Mark Zuckerberg come to the White House and basically convince him to not take any kind of action against platforms like Facebook with regards to antitrust law. Basically because he managed to wine and dine Trump. The same thing, or a very similar thing, happened with Tim Cook and tariff exemptions. So I think there's the debate about whether or not we're getting closer and closer to something like public carrier or actually, breaking these corporations up. But on the other hand, there's an important lesson for Republicans here, which is when you're in power, you actually have to pursue your agenda. Otherwise, you end up in this situation where you're begging Twitter and Facebook to allow you back on their platforms.
Julia, the right is clearly so very animated by so-called big tech issues, and is I think has become almost obsessed with the idea of being censored by Twitter, Facebook, etc. Do you think this issue is a winning issue for Republican politicians to run on, for Trump to make a kind of comeback bid if he chooses to go in that direction?
I think it's a winning issue with the base. Like you said, this is something that really animates a lot of Republicans. And you've seen President Trump himself, ever since he was kicked off the platform in January, continuing to push this narrative that he's being censored. You've in turn seen Republicans really going back into the Trump administration, even saying that these social media platforms are left-leaning and try to censor their voices and such. So this is definitely something I could see playing really well in a Republican primary, whether it's in the midterms in 2022 or even the presidential primary in 2024. And if President Trump decides to run again, it'll be interesting to see how he uses this narrative, and if he's not let back on Twitter, how he is able to connect with that base. Look, Twitter was a huge platform for him, and he was able to get his message out. I just don't think these statements that he sends out via email are as animating as Twitter. So we'll have to see how that plays out, but this is a good issue for the base for sure.
Pedro, so what is the argument he's making here? Because obviously Trump was on Twitter for nearly the entirety of his presidency. He got to say whatever he wanted. I think far from censoring him, Twitter treated him with kid gloves, not taking action against him in circumstances where I think they would have taken action against anyone else. Now he says, fine, the Taliban is still on. That's obviously hypocritical and ridiculous, but there's no legal, what's the legal rationale to make Twitter lives up to its terms of service?
I think he makes a indirect appeal to Section 230 when he says that it's an unconstitutional immunity that basically results in this double standard. But again, Trump was in office. If he wanted to do something about Section 230, he had 4 years to do it. These are all things that kind of look a lot like sour grapes. I agree that the messaging here actually looks a lot like groveling. Please, Jack Dorsey, let me back on your platform. So in terms of will this be successful in court, I don't think so. There's really not a whole lot of grounds here. And the point about Twitter being pressured by Congress, I don't know if that's going to help. I can't see how any of this stuff, or at least the argument that he's made here in the beginning, is going to actually get him back on these platforms. There are alternatives. Trump had the ability to, at least for a time before Amazon threw it off the internet, jump on Parlor and use that to boost his message. There's also Gab. There are alternatives, but his advisors told him to not get on those platforms. There's a little bit of back dealing here about questions of equity or control of these alternative platforms in exchange for Trump actually being on them. So again, if you've been keeping track of the Trump censored big tech saga, there are a lot of questions that have led us to this point about what is Trump doing? Is he actually going to take action against these corporations if he gets back into the White House in 2024? And why is he still listening to his advisors who are telling him, do not use alternative media platforms. Instead, just demand that Facebook, Twitter, and so on allow you back on.
And Julia, what's the political rationale behind it not jumping onto those platforms for Trump? And Pedro, I'd be curious for your take on this too.
Well, for not jumping back onto Twitter and Facebook, I think the political rationale would be that these are institutions, these are companies that are already biased against conservatives, to figures like President Trump, and that if they're going to go that way, then we'll go to a platform like Parlor, for example, or we've heard talk of Trump wanting to launch his own social media platform. So it's almost like a protest and saying we're not going to go in that direction.
Yeah, but Pedro, why do you think he didn't get on Parlor or Gab? Is it actually just kind of crony corruption around his circle and the people around Parlor? They wouldn't kind of buy him onto the platform, or was there some broader resistance that had something to do with what image he was trying to project?
So I spoke to the CEO of Gab, Andrew Torba, and his answer was that Trump's team came to me, asked me for equity in the company. I said no, and that was the end of our conversation. Forbes ran a piece that actually also contacted Andrew Torba, and I think they also spoke to people at Parlor. It was a very similar thing. There's an article in BuzzFeed about this, that basically Trump's team approached them and said, in exchange for Trump's presence on the platform, which draws more users, we want control of the company and basically access to data. And the Parlor thing didn't work out because obviously Amazon kicked them off the internet, and the Gab thing fell through because Andrew Torba just didn't want to get on the platform. The Hill ran a story claiming that Jared Kushner had told Trump that Gab was anti-Semitic and a kind of cesspool of racism, and so basically it would be bad for the Trump brand to get him on there. But again, look, if you're really desperate to get your message out, why not use something like Gab now while you're going to war with Twitter? Instead, it's only Twitter. So I think the point about institutions is correct. Twitter is a kind of institution in a sense, but I think we also have to be, or at least if I'm Trump, I'm looking at creating new institutions, parallel ones.
Yeah, it strikes me that the probably the best thing that could happen for Trump's argument that these are operating like public utilities, or they are public utilities, is what the Biden administration is doing, which is this aggressive pressure the White House has been putting on companies like Facebook to make certain moderation decisions with respect to the pandemic, which to my mind, that actually, so it'd be funny if their actions end up giving some credence to the things Trump's claiming. Julia, Pedro, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.